land on the moon in Kerbal Space Program. So, 1, you have to get into orbit. This is the easy step, although it is still quite hard. So, you have to fire directly upwards for a significant portion until your apoapus reaches 70 kilometers, or at least gets close. Then you have to fire sideways. You could fire at an angle the whole time, but that would be harder and might not go well due to atmospheric drag and that sort of thing. But you then fire sideways.
Sideways relative to which direction?
90 degrees eastward.
Why eastward?
Eastward because of the Earth's orbit. If you look at it from a surface perspective, when you're just standing on the ground, you're going at 0 meters per second. But if you look at it from an orbital perspective, you're going at 100 meters per second eastward. So you already have some additional speed if you're going eastward, so it saves you a lot of fuel. And fuel is very important. So, next, let's say you get into orbit. You're really good at the game, so you manage to get a perfect equatorial orbit because you fired exactly 90 degrees eastward with very, very little fluctuation. And let's say you're even better at the game and manage to make your orbit exactly 100 kilometers away from the ground at all points. Well, away from sea level. And so, when you have made your apoapus and your periapus both at 100 kilometers, then you have a perfectly stable equatorial orbit. In real life, the moon in Kerbal Space Program is also at an elliptical orbit, though it is much farther away. So, but in real life, it's not, so this makes real life moon landings even harder. But anyway, in Kerbal Space Program, it is at a perfectly stable elliptical orbit. So what you do is you fire in a prograde direction so that your orbit expands, and you look at the right timing such that you will enter the moon's sphere of influence, its gravity, significantly, and then you will make adjustments when you're there such that you go into orbit around the moon. And then you fire in a retrograde direction, thus losing speed and making your orbit tighter and tighter, and then you land on the moon. Ideally, you would then fire backwards quite a bit to lose your speed even more, so you could come to a nice, gentle landing on the moon.
Have you done this yet?
No, but that's how you're supposed to do it.
Okay, what have you done?
I have managed to do all of this. Well, I haven't actually managed to get into a perfectly stable elliptical orbit. I mean equatorial orbit. That stays at 100 kilometers exactly. That's really hard. I managed to get into orbit, and in an orbit that would take me into the moon's sphere of influence, and that's what's important. It's just a lot easier if you're able to do that with an equatorial orbit.
Okay.
So, and then I've managed to make it into lunar orbit, but I haven't been able to actually slow down enough to land on the moon without crashing.
So you have landed on the moon.
Yes, with crashing.
With crashing. So your astronauts would have preferred that they did not land on the moon?
Yes.
I see.
Well, they wouldn't be doing much preferring afterwards, but Anyway.
But you got something to the moon.
That's true. We got something to the moon. So you managed to slow down just enough to land on the moon. You're then going to perform whatever you wanted to do there. It might just be planting a flag, or it might be doing some scientific analysis or something.
Get a rock.
Yeah, get a rock. But then you get back up. Oh yes, there's another stage. You separate from the landing system, which you will leave on the moon. You can't take it up with you. It just be too heavy.
So the landing struts.
Yeah, the landing struts, the engine, the fuel tanks.
Everything that you use to slow down.
Yes.
Okay.
Then you go to a hopefully much smaller engine with maybe some of the science and the crew quarters and that sort of thing. Alternatively, you might just transmit your findings on the original craft if weight is too big of a concern. And then you wouldn't have to carry back your science equipment.
So weight's very important.
Weight is critical.
Okay.
Even if you have a very large vessel, weight is still important. So you head back into lunar orbit. Once again, hopefully a fully equatorial orbit around the moon. You fire in a direction such that you will enter the Earth's sphere of influence. And also, hopefully, it'll put you in orbit and you'll have enough fuel left to get into orbit instead of just going on an escape trajectory, which is bad, I can say from experience. The fuel is very important in this, but then you fire in a retrograde direction, slowing down from your escape trajectory, and you will hopefully stay in orbit around Earth. And then, once you're done with being in orbit around Earth, you will you will fire in a retrograde direction once again. It doesn't really matter where you land, as long as you land somewhere. It's generally preferable to land in water or on a specific target, but it doesn't necessarily have to be.
So how do you land? Are you using powered and fuel, or are you using parachutes?
So, there are different ways to land. Let's take you through the three main ones. The first one is not great. Essentially, you just keep firing until you slow down enough, and then you just hit the ground at a slower speed because you fired. This is a bad idea. Though it was considered for a while, but eventually it was decided to be a bad idea.
Isn't that what SpaceX does with their landing rockets, though? Don't they have them land on pads?
They do for some of their stuff. I don't know about all of it, but that's quite expensive, and if they do, SpaceX has figured out a really impressive way to do that.
Okay.
Generally, it's not a good idea to use
landing powered landings.
Yes, but there are always exceptions.
Okay.
Powered landings are out for now, unless you're trying to land on a very specific target, in which they can be useful. But other than that, it's generally just better to use one of the other two strategies. The next strategy is to use very, very powerful landing struts, angled specifically at the angle in which you'll hit the ground, and the landing struts absorb most of the impact. This is what some of the earlier Mars rovers did. They've stopped doing that now that they've gotten bigger, using strategies like the sky crane. But the generally best strategy to use is a parachute. So, you just fly in, use your heat shield to absorb the majority of the speed, and then once you're getting pretty low, your first opportunity, deploy your parachute. It'll fly up. For the first while, it will do nothing, maybe slow you down a little bit, but the air is too thin. But once you reach the area where the airspeed is ideal, it'll slow you down to something like 8 meters per second, which is enough for a landing.
Okay, why can't you use that on the moon again?
No air.
That's right.
Which means that you have to either
You have
use
to have a powered landing.
or you have to be really good at struts.
Have you
not
tried
struts.
to do struts?
I have. That was the earlier crash landing. Struts are hard, which is why it's generally better to use a parachute.
Or no?
So there are two types of parachute landing. There is a ground landing. It's generally preferable to come with struts on those, but it's a lot easier. And also, you don't necessarily need the struts. They're just preferable for that, because sometimes the payload is too heavy in comparison to the parachute, and it doesn't slow down quite enough. Like, instead of 7 or 6 meters per second, it might only slow down to 12, and that could still be destructive. Though significantly less so than landing at 200 meters per second, which is what you might do if you forgot your parachute.
Have you done that before?
Yeah, once or twice I forgot to add a parachute when I was building. And so I reverted those flights.
Okay.
But, anyway, next, there are water landings. These struts are useless for. You do not need struts for water landings.
They would just add weight.
Yeah. You just land on hopefully right side up. If not, though, that's fine too for water landings. And
I think if your parachute is facing down, you're not.
Oh, yes. If your parachute is facing down, then that's very bad. But anyway, you land, and then you just splash down. It creates a big splash, and then you wait for recovery teams to show up.
What speed can you land at in the water?
I don't know the exact numbers, but it's
About the same as 8?
I think it's a little bit faster, but yeah, essentially the same. I feel like 8 is the threshold. If you land on 8, that's really kind of pushing it on land with no struts or anything. But that's 100% fine on water. You can land a little bit faster than that even on water. And also, you're less likely to have to deal with stuff like, you wouldn't have to deal with stuff like mountains, which if they're at an angle can be bad. You don't particularly want your ship after you've already cut the parachute because you landed, starting to roll and rolling down a cliff. So those are the types of, that is how you get to the moon and back, and it is difficult, and wow, this is 15 minutes. It's very difficult.